When my film got to Cannes, I didn't even know Cannes existed. And then I heard that, oh, my film got to Cannes 2 weeks too late. And Favre Lebre, who was head of Cannes in those days, sent me a wonderful letter saying, oh, it's a wonderful film, we'd love to have had it. However, it was entered 2 weeks too late. Somebody sent me a page from a London newspaper with a big picture of me, and it said, is this the new Orson Welles? Nobody could have been more surprised than me. As you know, I made the film, I guess it's about 45 years ago. I can't believe the numbers when I say them. Before I got into the film business, I was an artist, and I'd gone to art school and been a cartoonist and illustrator. Anyway, this is my studio after art school and a couple of years as a painter. I guess it's too long a story, but on a trip to California on a mission for my mother, looking for a man that shouldn't go with. My father died when I was rather young. Anyway, but while out here, I happened to, by chance, be invited onto a soundstage at Paramount, walked down the studio, in the soundstage, and the minute I saw the soundstage, I thought, oh my God, it's people that make movies. I said, that's what I want to do. And there was nothing shooting. I swear, that's exactly, and I was determined from then on and I didn't know where to begin. I thought, well, I'll fool around out here. Instead of going back home, try to find out what the acting's about. Anyway, eventually got back east, went into an acting school, did summer stock. There's me acting in summer stock, did set designing in summer stock. Anyway, from the day that I walked on that soundstage, which was 1951, in 1959 I was making Blast of Silence, which as I look back, I realized it was a hell of a jump, starting from nowhere. I didn't know which end of a camera was the lens and which was the eyepiece. I had no training in film, other than the use of a still camera with regard to the artwork I'd done. So I knew a little bit about lenses from a still camera and the idiosyncrasies of black and white film at the time and so on to some extent. But other than that, I knew nothing about formal editing and using of a film camera and so on, although I understood it instinctively. But due to my art background, there's no doubt about it, because when I was a cartoonist, for instance, I'd get a script and I'd have to, over the shoulder, I would draw it. I'd have to sketch all those things purely out of my imagination. So when the advantage of having a camera and people, I thought, wow. I went into it in one way thinking I was blind in many areas, and perhaps I was, but in other ways my visual instincts, that I knew I could trust. If I looked at something, I just knew what was good looking. I knew a composition that was good looking, just instinctively.
Come into Manhattan by dark, whatever time of day it is, through tunnels, like sewers hidden under the city. But you don't mind that. It's always that way, whatever city it is. should be. You've always been alone. By now, it's your trademark. You like it that way.
I'm Alan Barron. 30 years ago, I was Frank Bono, arriving on this train as a professional killer in the film Blast of Silence. I'm about to tell you a story of the making of the film and also a little bit about the man behind it, myself, my dreams, the difficulties, and the joys in doing this film.
The railroad company makes sure you don't forget you're coming to town on Christmas. It gives you the creeps. But that's all right. Everyone on the goodwill kick, maybe they'll leave you alone.
Lionel Stander was a blacklisted actor. He did the narration, and he wanted $1,000 if we used his name, because he had some sort of a name. You know, he'd worked a lot as an actor. To me, he was famous. Or $500 if we didn't use his name. Well, naturally, with the amount of money we had, we took the $500 deal. So that's why he doesn't have a credit.
You hate cities, especially at Christmas. But that's all right, too. When the Better Business Bureau rings the Christmas bell, the suckers forget there's such a business as murder. And businessmen who make it their exclusive line. Like you, baby boy Frankie Bono, out of Cleveland.
When I was a boy, this was my neighborhood. There's an alley where I played. It's an old grocery store when I was a boy. I have very fond memories. Of course, this was a candy store, and that was a place where the boys and I played. We used to play a game called Kick the Can, where we'd put a can on the corner here and run the four corners and hide and go seek. And the entrance to the candy store was right here. And those days people didn't have telephones. And I used to earn money by calling people to the phone, people that lived in the neighborhood, and they would give us a nickel or a dime, depending on how far they lived. And around the corner I lived right here. If I remember correctly, there was a little vegetable store here. Yes, there was. And a little further over here, when I was 11, after my father died, I moved here with my mother and younger sister. And of course, it looked a lot different. The doorway wasn't as prison-like. We didn't park cars in the street like this. That was our kitchen. We had 3 rooms. And we used to play ball along this wall here. Handball. It's a very, very strange feeling to come here and see it once again. It all looks a lot smaller than it did in those days. That was my bedroom window there. And I kept a bicycle down here. We used to run through these alleys. The fence wasn't here. We'd play ball in this whole area.
Now you know the pattern the job will take. A waiting job. Waiting to find where Troiano goes to be alone. And you know another thing. He'll have to be quick and silent while he's away from his bodyguards. It'll be a job for a gun. That means another bad moment, another contact. Your hands sweat a little on the wheel, remembering another Christmas, running from the cops.
Downey's Restaurant is a very, very special place to me. Played a very significant role in my life, and just about anybody who's anybody in the theater or in Hollywood at the moment, whether it's Marlon Brando, Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, Cassavetes, Geraldine Page. I mean, to name 5 or 6 is to ignore 1,000. And we would come here and gather to all hours of the night. Jim Downey was a wonderful Irishman who very often carried us when many of us didn't have any money. I'm not sure more than half ever paid him when they eventually did make it in Hollywood. And the role it played in my life was that when I first got into the film business, I would meet people here, met people to talk with and explore ideas and so on. And as a matter of fact, among the many people that I met and became very close with at the time was Peter Falk. Anyway, the significance of meeting Peter was that I expected him to play the role of Frankie Bono in Blast of Silence, and he had agreed to do so. However, he was given or offered the part in a picture called Murder Incorporated, which led to his career, and they were offering him money and I couldn't afford to pay him anything. And I had that time had some acting experience. It was not my intention to play the leading role, but like everything else in the film, we did the best we could with what we had. And I was the best actor available to me at the time, and I was the only one I could afford. So I wrote it, directed it, and then there I was, forced to act it. The truth is, I didn't want to play the role. And at the time, we told the laboratory that we had more money than we did, and they deferred the fee for development. And then Eastman Kodak, they figured, well, we're going to produce a film. They solicited us, and they had a new raw stock. We said, well, we'll use it, provided you allow us to test it. So they gave us a role. That was used for my screen test, and the scenes that I did in it were used in the film. The specific scenes were, for instance, Penn Station, using a telephone, reading a newspaper after murdering Big Ralph. And I was very nervous about it because the next day at Movie Lab, we sat down and looked at the rushes. And I wasn't sure whether I'd be acceptable as the leading character in this picture. And I looked at it, and there's several other people there, and I said, well, I think this kid could make it. Speaking about my own performance. Anyway, I must say I was still very nervous because I remember, although we even used that footage, by the way, it's in the film, but I remember the night before we began shooting, I looked in the mirror and I thought, oh God, Baron, you're either going to make the biggest fool of yourself or who knows. That's the truth. And so we knew we didn't have enough money to make a complete film. We had $2,800. We had raw stock, which we had rescued from a film we had worked on in Cuba. That I was working with Errol Flynn on not directing, but working on a low-budget film in Cuba under Castro. But we knew we could show that we'd have maybe 15 to 20 minutes of film that would be exciting enough to attract money. Well, there's a scene in the film the end of the film where I jump off a bridge, no stunt man, it was me. And it was a very cold day. And after that was over and I was exhausted, I wound up here in Downey's, eating a steak, recovering from the ordeal of the snow and the shooting and so on, and acting and directing and swimming in Jamaica Bay. And sure enough, a man I hadn't seen since I was a boy walked in with two other gentlemen. And he said, oh, how are you? What are you doing? And I said, you see the weather out there? And it was snowing. I said, I jumped in Jamaica Bay. He says, what are you talking about? He knew me as an artist and as a cartoonist. I said, I'm making a film. And so he said, what do you mean? I said, I'm making a film. And he said, well, why don't you come back and speak to me? Well, I spoke to him and this other man who was a man named Al Crown, who since died. He had been an executive with major motion pictures, and told him what we're doing. And they said, well, let's see what you have. Well, the following day, they came up to Movie Lab. We screened the footage for them, and they were very impressed. They said, what do you need? I said, well, I think with about $18,000 in cash, we could complete the film. $18,000 in cash, you've got it. No salary for us and so on. And with that $18,000, the original $2,800, plus the lab deferment and the raw stock, and the equipment we had rescued from this film we worked on in Cuba, we proceeded to finish the film, amazingly enough. But the reason we are here is to celebrate this wonderful place and the role it played in my life, and thousands and thousands of actors who whoever sees this will absolutely, if not be tearful, will be delighted that we've at least preserved if only the exterior, because unfortunately it's closed, and we're told that the interior no longer exists. The interior had a wonderful bar, photographs of all the famous actors, And it was the most gemütlich, warm place that I have ever known. I wish it was still here. If it were up to me, I would have made a museum out of it. However, c'est la vie.
At noon, you make contact. The wind is cold as you approach the ferry, but the palms of your hands start to sweat. This is the first bad moment. There's always a few on every job when you're not alone. You can depend on yourself, no one else. You've learned the hard way. They all hate the gun they hire. When people look at you, baby boy Frankie Bono, they see death. Death across the counter.
One of the reasons I chose this particular location is that the city itself plays a very significant role in the film. It's practically an additional character. And the ferry gave it a wonderful overview. And as you can see, it's a magnificent view, and at the same time, it played a very specific purpose in the film.
You got a match, bud?
When we originally did this shot, where I met the character with the Ohio book matches and so on, the ferry had tremendous vibration, and I recall we had the tripod. We solved the problem by putting the tripod into some cardboard boxes stuffed with rolled up newspaper. And amazingly enough, that worked very well. Then I believe we made about 5 or 6 trips back and forth until we finally got the complete scene. And I think it worked rather well, obviously. Anyway, the skyline is quite a bit different than it was in the film.
Now you're alone again. You relax. Your hands are cold now, even with gloves on. On your own again, nothing to worry about. The target's name is Troiano. You know the type. Second-string syndicate boss with too much ambition. And a mustache to hide the fact he has lips like a woman. The kind of face you hate. Today, the brakes are with you, and you stay with him while he makes his morning rounds. The streets of Harlem are busy enough. No one notices you. You catch a danger signal. Your hands are sweating, but that's all right, because you know what it is. The hate of Harlem. You hate them, and they hate you. Like another Harlem where you grew up.
Harlem always fascinated me. New York, especially in those days when I did Blast of Silence, always fascinated me. But Harlem had a very special quality to it. What I always really liked about Harlem is that it had a certain kind of mystery and intrigue, a certain kind of excitement that you couldn't find downtown. When we were doing Blast of Silence, it was very difficult to hide the fact that we were shooting even though it was a secret camera. And you'll notice when you see the film, people are constantly glancing at the camera and so on. But the biggest difficulty we had was from the New York Police Department. They saw us continuously circling the block, and they pulled us over, and they accused us of doing secret photography on the New York Police Department, which was strange, and we told them, no, we are doing a film. They said, open up your truck. We opened up, and they saw a cameraman. And we said, listen, you are preventing us from shooting. And he said, no, you're taking pictures of cops. So he phoned for his captain. And the captain came down, said, did these people break any laws? And they said, no. Well, then let them go. It only cost us an hour of shooting time. But we were winging things while shooting the film, and that was just another one of the many, many adventures when you shoot a film on a fly string. Now, the Apollo Theater is probably one of the most famous theaters in the world. We've had, I suppose, every important performer, certainly in the black world and in the white world, has performed here. Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Billie Holiday, Sammy Davis Jr., Frank Sinatra. And they used to have a wonderful amateur night. And if you weren't good, they had a man, I believe his name was called Pygmy Pete. He would come with a giant hook and pull you off the stage while the audience cheered. And when I was a teenager, I came with a friend of mine. He was white, and his brother, and they did a double act on piano. And we cheered them and so on. And I have very fond memories of it again, because there was a special excitement about Harlem. And that's why I used it in Blast of Silence. And it's nice to see that it's still here. The scene that we did in Blast of Silence, whereby I met these two characters on this street corner which we're coming to. The two men that I used in the film, I believe one was a high school teacher and the other man worked for the city, and yet we used them as gangsters in the picture. It worked very well. And we shot that scene at this corner that we're about to come to with the Apollo Theater in the background. And again, we just stole the scene, as they say, with no police permits. And like so much of Blast of Silence, we shot it on the seat of our pants. And here's where that scene took place, and it worked out very well. Anyway, again, it's marvelous to be here and see the changes. And in some respects, it saddens me too, because as I said, so much of the color of the area has simply disappeared. In watching Triano, the character that I am about to assassinate, as an actor, I thought that standing and watching was at times almost a sexual thrill for Frankie Bono. I think there were all sorts of, if you will, perverse ideas that he had with regard to his position vis-a-vis the man he was about to kill. Had to build up an artificial hatred, because after all, there's a man he's never seen, never, except while tracking him to kill him, had no personal relationship with him, and yet found all sorts of devices to build up this enormous hatred to justify the killing. And among the many feelings I felt were there were these perversities that I'm mentioning. And as I said, I suspect there is something even in a minor way and in a perverse way, sexual. And those are some of the qualities I played anyway in doing it. And so in standing like this, observing him across the street, these are some of the thoughts that went through my head.
He thinks he looks like a gentleman if his shoes are shined. You could kill him right now with pleasure.
Well, this has hardly changed, other than the fact that Triano used to eat there in 1960, and now it's the Cherry Lane Theater. And it essentially looks very much like it did. I chose Christmas time because I knew New York Christmas time is a fantastic contrast against a professional killer out to do what he was out to do. Here the songs were goodwill and peace to all men. And here's a man in the city for the sole purpose of murdering somebody. And at the same time, suffering his own inner pain. At the time that I did the film, there were writer friends who said that, oh, you can't do a film about a professional killer. Who would you root for? Who would you like? I mean, how could you like a man that is a murderer? And that wasn't the point. I felt that the man was really a metaphor of all of man's loneliness. It's been referred to as an existential expression, which I suppose it was. But primarily, I just believed in the fact that through this character, I was expressing something that was universal. Thank you. I use this scene, this newsstand in Blast of Silence, because I lived in that building right there where I also worked as a cab driver, as an artist. I used to sell my paintings at a little art shop straight down the street here. And the street is much different. We had an L train along here in old tenement buildings. And the long walk shot in Blast of Silence was done up a hill, straight along this area in 34th Street. It's so different now with trees and awnings, it's impossible to recreate the shot. But that was the inspiration for these locations, living in this area, working in this area, and what's fascinating is to see the difference. What does remain, of course, is this newsstand, which has changed architecturally, but still in the same place. And there's no doubt it's a dramatic change, except for some of those buildings on that side of the street. Otherwise, it's almost totally unrecognizable. After Frankie Bono murdered Big Ralph, the fat man, gun peddler, which is something he didn't intend to do. And Bono was basically, as I said, considered himself a perfectionist. And it's kind of odd, you know, to be a professional murderer and pick up a newspaper and read about it. He also knew he was in trouble once he read about it.
The worst trouble in your life, but you can't get the scream out of your head to concentrate. For the first time in your life, you don't want to be alone.
The reason I selected a location like this is because Frankie Bono, the character, is essentially a very alienated figure. And I wanted to show his solitude. And that was really very unlike, I would say, untypical of mafia types that I'd met. Living in New York, raised where I was, it was almost impossible not to have some dealings with them. And years ago, when I was an artist, as a matter of fact, an illustrator, I was commissioned by some of those types. I was requested to do a mural in an automobile showroom on Park Avenue and 57th Street. As a matter of fact, Greta Garbo lived in the building, and every evening the man who would sweep up would tell me that she'd watched the progress of this mural. And the mafia characters that noticed the mural hired me away to do some other work for them. It involved painting birds with black light, believe it or not, in the Havana Madrid, which is an old nightclub that was in New York. Well, I warned them. I said, listen, I'm afraid that this fluorescent light will kill the birds. They said, Baron, just do what we're telling you to do. And I must say, there were characters that I couldn't refuse. Anyway, they picked me up one evening at 2 o'clock in the morning and gave me an airbrush. And they waited for the customers to leave, and they had about 30 or 40 of these birds they wanted to fluoresce. I said, gentlemen, this is going to kill the birds. They said, Baron, just paint the birds. I said, all right. And I'm spraying the birds, and the feathers are going, and these gangsters and some of them escaped, and they're running around this nightclub. It's an absurd scene. I said, look, I'm afraid. They said, just paint the birds. I said, fine. Well, the next day, there were about 40 dead birds in the nightclub. I'm sorry to say, but I really had I had very little choice in the matter. But these are, in addition to which, I had done some other drawings for them, and they never paid me. I mean, with all the glamour of The Godfather and everything else, the truth of the matter is, they were very cheap. I was a starving artist. They didn't pay me for my supplies or my paints or anything. So I was always very unimpressed with The Godfather. And apparently, the good fellow has a more accurate depiction of what gangsters actually are. They were, I would say, the antithesis of what the Frankie Bono character was.
You're relaxing now. Hands cold again. There'll be a gun in them soon. And your mind's running clear and cool. Expert. As an engineer designing a bridge. You could have been an engineer.
You know, this strange world of Frankie Bono, professional murderer. On this barge that he came to purchase a gun, he was conducting what for him was a normal business transaction. At the same time, he carried these delusions. I mean, here he was buying a gun to murder a man. He's nothing but a lowly murderer. And he had delusions of being a bridge builder, among other things. It's a strange dichotomy. But I think there's something universal in that. I think that contradiction exists in many of us in different ways. I think many of us fantasize everything from murder to being kings. Except here was a man who acted out something much more vile than most of us can possibly consider, I hope. God knows there are enough murderers in the world. Anyway, what I think is fascinating about Frankie Bono is the contradiction, the constant dichotomy between the fantasy of being the bridge builder and the reality of standing on this barge in the cold, waiting for a man to deliver a gun that he can then dispose of. And that's what I think made it a kind of fascinating, dramatic character.
You're feeling better now you got Christmas out of your system. You begin to feel the excitement that always comes as you start to close in. In the middle of the afternoon, Troiano goes into a small brownstone. He leaves his protection outside. Now you know where Troiano goes alone. You're moving now, smooth, like a piece of precision machinery. Before you hit the target in his little love nest, you have to know everything about the flat and the building as well as the architect who built it. You could have been an architect, too.
"30 years ago, the architecture was a little different. This wall was not quite the same. The doorway and the framework was the same. When we originally did this shot, we worked this hallway without permission, people constantly interrupting the shooting, stepping over cables. I remember our 35mm Aeroflex fell second day of production, and we were terribly worried, but miraculously none of the elements were hurt. It happened to be on a 16mm tripod. But we worked this hall with people coming and going, got all those wonderful shots. That was it. This is the roof that we shot Blast on. This is where Frankie Bono came while surveying the scene before he murders Troiano, the character. But I was reflecting on some incidents that happened back in 1960, 61, when my film was shown in France. And I remember reading some controversy in Variety. And apparently some people felt that I had imitated Godard with Breathless, with Jean-Paul Belmondo wandering around Paris, which amused me because I didn't see that film at least until 2 years after I did Blast of Silence. But in analyzing it, I realized that the reason for the similarity was because Godard worked with very little money. He used Paris like I used New York. And there was that gritty, wonderful feeling it had. It also followed one character with fantasies in his head and so on. So I suppose it had that similarity with pure coincidence. I hadn't heard of Godard, as I said, until at least 2 years after I'd done Blast of Silence. And of course, this film began with a B also. So I think it's a wonderful coincidence. And I appreciated what he did in the film. I'm a big fan of Belmondo's. I'm a big fan of Paris. But I'm also equally a big fan of this wonderful city, New York, with all of the great architecture, ugliness, the beauty in the ugliness, the characters, the difficulties, the straining to survive, the strength it takes to exist in this place. All of that helped much of the inspiration and attitudes that I had with regard to the film and the character in the film. And I knew with very little money that the city wouldn't fail me. It would have all of these wonderful colors, as it did, including a scene that I had whereby Frankie Bono looks out of his window.
How do you like that? It's not in your head at all. An orphanage. A crummy orphanage right under your nose.
His background was where he was raised in a Catholic school. Very strict was the implication.
Remembering.
And he's looking down at these students being lined up by the nuns, and they form a swastika. Now, I didn't stage that. It happened to be a scene that I observed out of an office window that I was in, and I thought how remarkable, just a strange phenomenon. And like so many other things in the film, I had to use it, and I did. And nobody asked me about that for 30 years, until one day at a screening in Munich. After the screening, a young girl approached me and said to me, "Mr. Barron, there was a scene where Frankie Bono looks out the window and sees a swastika. Did you intentionally do that?" And I remember what I said to her. I said, "God bless you." I said, "Do you know, in 30 years of interviews, questions, people seeing the film, you're the first person to ask me that question." I said, "You have wonderful eyes."
Keeping watch on Troiano, you feel a hate shaping up at the back of your neck where the hair is short. That's a good sign. You get a feeling this is how it was meant to be. Like you are Troiano's fate. Like your God.
Frankie Bono was a man of many illusions about himself. And in the narration, which is designed to be a Greek chorus, his alter ego, he alludes to the fact that he could have been an engineer, could have been many things, and in this case, even God. I suppose the fact that he had the power of life and death, and that he did, he was an expert at what he knew, which was killing. He had these delusions about the things he could have done if he didn't do what he was doing. And the narrative character plays that role in the film. And of course, the fact is, I doubt if Frankie Bono really could have done anything else but killed, given who he was. But I suppose the thing that kept him going is the fact that he felt he had choices. Well, the choice he made was to be a professional killer. And I think finally when he died, it was probably the choice that he preferred and he finally achieved. The reason I picked this house for Blast of Silence was it had a lot of character, and I think somebody I knew the owner. But we didn't know any of the residents. And I remember when we were shooting, we often would have to stop because some old lady would come out of a door, step over the cable, etc. And the accident with the camera that I had explained previously took place. And I remember thinking nothing was going to stop me from making this film. And of course, this is where Troiano got murdered, the character that Frankie Bono pursued. There used to be a grated door, which is no longer there. The architecture of the house has changed. They put an awning up, which wasn't there. The roof has changed quite a bit. And this tree has sprung up. There were no trees on the entire street in those days. I'm delighted to see it here now. So, like all other things we've seen, and we'll see, it has gone through some changes. But I was delighted when I found it, when I went exploring to see what is here after 30 years and what isn't here. And when I found this, it was like finding an old friend. When I was a boy, I used to come to this area, skip school very often. We used to call it the Old Mill. I think it was built perhaps sometime after World War I. I don't know why they called it the Old Mill, but it was actually a fishing village. And When we played hooky from school, very often we would come down here and we'd heard all these stories about the mafia burying bodies here and killing people. Of course, we never found a body, but I actually do believe the act was committed here. In 1960, when I was planning Blast of Silence, I thought of this place and I was wondering if it still existed because I hadn't seen it for many years since I was a boy. And we came out and to my amazement, we found it just as pristine as I'd remembered, except it was largely abandoned. And it was perfect, just perfect. The exact kind of atmosphere I wanted for the killing scene in the end. Except the day that we arrived here to shoot, it was a very, very sunny day. And the plan was to have the entire picture in a very gray atmosphere. And I couldn't conceive of Frankie Bono dying in a sunshine. And wouldn't you know it, New York, as gray as it normally is in the wintertime, the day we got here to shoot, the area was totally flooded with sunshine. So our little crew packed up and we figured, well, wintertime in New York. We assumed that in about 3 days or so, at most, we would have our gray weather. Well, it turned out to be one of the sunniest winters New York has ever had. And we waited, I believe, at least 10 days before we had a gray day. We looked out the window, and sure enough, the skies were gray, made some quick phone calls, gathered up as many people as we could. As a matter of fact, we were shy one actor, so that in that final scene, I was forced to play one of the actors that was chasing me. But it worked. The old buildings were there, and we got that wonderful snowstorm, which I absolutely thought was a gift from God, with the weeds blowing and everything else. Our camera froze, and we had all kinds of difficulty, but it was well worth it. And so that was the advantage of working with a small crew and being able to have that privilege. After a storm one day, when we were playing hooky from school, we found a duck boat along here, and actually it was further out in the bay, and we built a special wagon and rolled it all the way back to Brooklyn, which is in that direction, and we then built a sailboat. We spent 2 months working on it, and then our mothers wouldn't allow us to sail in it. So we sold it for about, I believe, $10. Over there is where the fishing village used to be, and now we merely have that creek. It's called Spring Creek today. And beyond that is what is now Kennedy Airport and Jamaica Bay. And of course, what is left of what used to be is merely this bay area. When this was a fishing village, there were canals running through the streets and little bridges connecting them, some of which I think we saw in Blast of Silence. And the last time I was here as a boy, we came looking for marine junk to sell to junkyards, etc. We thought the place was deserted. And we loaded this wagon, and as we were pushing it, suddenly a shotgun blast rung out, and we realized it wasn't deserted. Anyway, the neighborhood, the area has gone through changes. The fishing village is gone. And obviously, it's like so many things in the world, this place has changed. And as I said, things are just not quite what they used to be. It's a very interesting experience coming back and seeing it once again.
God moves in mysterious ways, they said. Maybe he is on your side the way it all worked out. Remembering other Christmases, wishing for something important, something special. And this is it, baby boy Frankie Bono. You're alone now, all alone. The scream is dead. There's no pain. You're home again. Back in the cold, black silence.
Interestingly enough, with regard to my making the film, after it was made, I had no idea what kind of reception it would receive. But some backers I had gotten, who'd put a small amount of money in after I'd begun the film, quickly, nervously made a deal with Universal Films, and I didn't know whether it was a good deal or a bad deal. They made a deal with them, I believe it was for US and Canada. And they released it as a second feature. And in spite of that, I got some wonderful reviews in the New York Times and the Herald Tribune and so on. And it also led to my going to Hollywood because the reviews were rather good, in spite of the fact that the studio gave it a kind of a very casual release with no publicity whatsoever. And so, having very little money, as a matter of fact, no money at all at the time, I went to Hollywood. And I look back now, and I think that with hindsight, as they say, one has genius. If I had to do over again, I think I would have remained in New York to continue doing the kind of films I knew how to do. But Hollywood is like a beautiful woman who who suffered from some eternal disease. Looked beautiful, but if you messed with her, you caught the disease. And of course, there's a history of many, many, many men more famous than me, more talented than me, who went to Hollywood and were chewed up. Hollywood does some wonderful things, but by the same token, I've often had the feeling that it sometimes captures somebody with talent just for the sake of owning them. I was placed under contract at 20th Century Fox to do a specific film. Unfortunately, they were doing Cleopatra, and I never got the opportunity to do that film. I then left my contract and went to New York and did another small film with Lee Grant called Pie in the Sky. And I must say it was very well received, but I don't think I made a proper release for it, and it went into oblivion as far as I know. I then went back to Hollywood and was under contract to Warner Brothers, where I was supposed to do another film. I spent a year there and could never quite get the approval I wanted for the film that I wanted to do. Well, then I had to pay the rent, my mortgage, and things of that nature, so I started to do television. And I've done some 250 or 300 television shows involving dramatic shows, half-hour comedies, everything from Charlie's Angels, Cagney and Lacey, and hundreds of others. When my film was rediscovered recently, after 30 years, I must say it took me by surprise, because I hardly expected the kind of reaction I got at Munich. I was delighted with it, of course. And it caused me to think about, and I was asked, what is it about the film that would get that reaction 30 years later from young people, older people, officials, newspapermen? And I must say, initially I was at a loss, and I gave it a great deal of thought. Watching the film in Munich for the first time in many years, I was moved in many ways. I found a very interesting thing that I had not realized when I had made the film, that subconsciously I really was projecting a good piece of myself, my own solitude, my own alienation. And that came as a bit of a surprise. I was conscious of a bit of it while I was making the film. And it's kind of interesting. As I said to someone, it's very much like if a film has your handwriting on it, whether you intend it to be that way or not. I had certain intentions in mind, and yet when I saw the film 30 years later, I clearly had projected something else, and I understood it to be very much a part of myself.
I have no regrets in terms of the choices I made with regard to making films or being involved. I mean, I've had some remarkable experiences and made some wonderful friends, and it's just great. From what I hear about the industry now, though, with DVD and the same equipment you're using now, I think it's flooded with a lot of people using fancy equipment but really don't know much about what they're doing. And the equipment does it all for them. It's like the difference between working with a typewriter and a computer. In my day, if you wrote a script and you made a mistake, you had to go all the way back to the beginning and cover it. And now, two presses of keys, and you've corrected anything for an entire script. Want to change the name in 100 pages? Bip, and it's changed. And so, if I were a young man today, I would dive right in and use that stuff. I'd be turning out films faster than Chef makes spaghetti. But what I thought was a terrific idea, it's too bad we never did it, called the Sound of Silence. I believe that's what I called it. And that was a good story. I would have played the main character who had been gone for 30-odd years at the time, about 30-odd years, and shows up at a film festival. And then I intercut a lot of little cuts from Blast of Silence with that. And apparently, as the story unfolds, we find out that he, in his actual life, his wife had been murdered, and he was a suspect, although he was not guilty. And because he had done that film, it sort of reflected negatively on him as a potential murderer. Turns out he was so disgusted with what life has brought him that he just took off. And next time we see him showing up at this film festival. And I intercut both things. And what happens is then he is approached by somebody because of the success of the film festival to do a film. And they want to do something that he considers trash. He, on the other hand, says, I have something I want to do. And anyway, they screw with him, and he loses his mind and fantasizes, and he's so angry at this producer who had brutally rejected him in New York at that time. He can't separate reality from fantasy. And he starts tracking this guy. And now we intercut scenes from Blast of Silence with scenes from that. But the short version is he eventually winds up shooting this man. In some ways, it literally parallels what he'd done in his movie. And he then runs off to that same area, which when I scouted it, because I thought I would do this film, other than the wooden stuff, was all there. I thought, wow, that's going to be remarkable to intercut the old footage with this. And he sees a couple, he's paranoid now, totally paranoid, and a couple of homeless are lying there, and they see him, and he sees them as the killers that followed him in Blast. And he gets into a struggle with them. One of them hits him in the head with a rock, and he dies by that same water, and it's in Blast of Silence. It's hard to tell that briefly, but that's roughly it, and I would have loved to have done that. But it just became a script on a shelf. But I didn't get any different deal than thousands of other people didn't get. Some are lucky, some are not. That's my tale of woe.